Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be hosting this panel. We have a very interesting group of panelists on board to discuss a very important topic. I myself am from the investment and development community, so I'm hoping to get a lot of insights from this. So we have Mr. Ajoy Mehta, who has been the ex-commissioner of Mumbai and right now heads Maharashtra RERA, which by all counts is possibly the most important real estate markets in the country. We have Dr. Athaide, who is the chairman and CEO, founder of Agrim Housing Finance. Our urban experts, Dr. Bhide and Rejeet Mathews. Dr. Bhide is the head of habitat studies at TIS, and Rejeet is the director of urban at WRI. So before I start, I'll just give a little bit of brief background uh, on the topic that we are discussing today and what we mean by high opportunity communities. So we are looking at a segment which is possibly low employment, high education, possibly migrants, who are the main contributors to the development of cities. And as we all know, cities have been the drivers of economic growth in the country. And in India, we are expecting to see the largest human migration from rural to urban areas going ahead. Now, when we look at this particular segment, which we term as EWS or LIG, they not only constitute migrants, but they also constitute a lot of people who are moving up the social ladder. And possibly, when you look at housing for them, they would seem ideal candidates for rental housing, which would need a lot of inclusive infrastructure and support. For developers, they have not been very excited about this segment till now. But definitely, as they progress up the social ladder, they become their first target markets. The focus for a long time in India has remained on ownership. But as we saw over the last 2, 3 years, there's been a fundamental shift in the market and government both are opening up to alternate models of residence or shelter, as I may put it. And it opens up some fascinating possibilities because we're not looking at conventional ways of how neighborhoods develop. And we can actually look at making them more resilient, more sustainable, and inclusive. Now, housing has always been, in some ways, looked upon as a subset of real estate. And real estate investment in India has always had an element of speculation. It's also a result of the abnormal returns and cash in the system we have. But at the pace cities are uh, growing in India, we need to look at housing provisioning much beyond a derivative of real estate. It becomes more of an urban development issue, and that's where the role of government becomes paramount. Now, when we say all of this, as a first step, what we uh, what we see is data, which is the key ingredient that goes into how do we come up with solutions. And in some ways, when we look at the massive PMAY program that the current government launched, it used evidence of non-affordability and migration to come up with solutions to cater to this demand. And though the target was massive, 20 million homes is by no means a small amount. It is the latest calculations say we are somewhere closer to 4 million homes delivered, which in 6 years, by any stretch of imagination, is a huge achievement. So, I'll start this discussion by asking Mr. Mehta that, you oversee possibly the most uh, important real estate market in the country through, and RERA has been in many ways a game changing regulation that has come in, and you generate a lot of data, and maybe you have possibly the most reliable and largest quantum of data in the country. How is it helping you on an ongoing decision process? And could you offer some insights on the whole affordable housing scenario as you see it in Maharashtra? Dr. Mehta.
Thank you, Dhaval. We've been talking about data about affordable housing. Let me tell you, if you see the real estate market in Maharashtra, that's what we overlook. It's completely lopsided. The center of gravity is very much in Mumbai, and the rest are just peripheral towns there. When you talk of affordable housing, Mumbai's affordable housing is more or less free. It's not affordable, it's free housing. Because you're either resettling the slum dwellers or you are resettling people who are in, cess buildings which are old and almost waiting to collapse, and they just cannot afford anything over there. So it's just a resettlement process that is taking place. The RERA law is such that we do not cover resettlement or where the free housing is there. We are covering the sale building part of it, the sale part of it. That's what we tend to cover. Now, having said that, the issue that we are looking is what happens to the sale component and what's happening on the sale component. Is sale component going to be affordable or not? That is one big issue. Now, the affordability of the sale component to a great extent depends on the land cost on which you are setting it up. So in Mumbai, for example, the land costs are so high that there is no way that anybody can build affordable housing in areas which have jobs. So in commercial areas, the land costs are so high that people have to build houses which pays for the land cost, and you tend to overshoot the affordable housing levels. So you're either going to 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms and things like that, which doesn't make it affordable for the common man. So that's where we are. I think the important issue here, as your topic says, is housing, opportunity housing. What is it that you do to create housing that creates opportunities, or housing that is available in an area where opportunities are available? Of course, opportunities you are very well defined in your outside with the statement saying it can't just be jobs, it's education, it's health. There's so many issues that amount to opportunities. Now, what is it that you do so that housing comes up in areas where opportunities are available? So I leave it at that, Dhaval, and if you carry on further, then maybe we could come to more of this thing.
So I'd like to come to Dr. Bhide on this and get her opinion. Ma'am, what do you think is opportunistic housing in this space, and how can we go about it? What is the data that you personally look at to come to decisions here?
I think I would actually like to concur with and begin with what Mr. Mehta said. Uh, Basically, I think the issue that one is talking about is very real. That housing needs to be where employment opportunities are. And where do employment opportunities and social opportunities exist? That is where most of the service networks exist. On the other hand, a solely housing approach or an affordable housing approach takes us to the periphery of cities. And in MMRDA region, for example, I think we failed very, very miserably in terms of creating rental housing units, which were determined by this FSI led construction only approach. And it doesn't work as rental housing, especially for the target group that one is discussing. So, what I would try to look at is perhaps trying to see where do currently migrant workers stay, and one comes across a range of housing arrangements which are being made, and these are arrangements which stretch from uh, informal housing arrangements within formal housing, such as whether SRAs or CHOLs or other existing housing, to thinking about informal settling as a way of housing. And the third possibility is really where one is also seeing where workers stay at the place of work in extremely precarious and in extremely untenable conditions. So, the way in which I would look at opportunity is how does one minimize this last category and shift it to some minimally acceptable standards of housing where the opportunities remain constant, uh, and at the same time the workers are moved to relatively safe conditions of living as well.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting because what we have been talking about, I think, general urban theory is a lot to do with transportation and development, because that can, in some ways, substitute or help. How would I say, connect housing to opportunities. But again, in cities like Bombay and any of the larger cities, they are also an issue because I was just looking at some data, and we have possibly a local train running on the Western line at something like 10 seconds, at that interval. So one of the largest, the busiest rail networks in the world. So it's very difficult to substitute it. We have to build a parallel network to it. So that's where I come to Rejeet. And Rejeet, could you give us some idea at an urban level? How would you approach this sort of a problem, and what data would you look at to say that, do I need some fundamental paradigm shift in the way we have looked at urban planning to address this issue?
You're talking about a sector that has not worked, urban planning. So, but thank you, Dhaval. And I've lived in Mumbai for many years. I now live in another big metropolitan region, which is the Delhi region. And one way, so other than all of the formal data that comes out, I wanted to agree with a few things that's already been said. Government is the biggest provider of affordable housing, just in terms of formal housing, of course. But the bulk of the housing is in the informal sector, for example, informal renting. One way we went about looking at data is actually going on ground and getting surveys done. So, in the region of Delhi, for example, we went to different areas of what we call as high density, low infrastructure areas, where lower income, sort of the migrants you're talking about, sort of the unemployed who come into cities looking for work. We asked them questions like, how do you get work? Where do you stay? What are your choices? And interesting findings that we got about from these surveys. We've written about it as well. One, it's very clear that community networks are tapping jobs for them. So, if I'm staying in a village, I get to know from a friend, a relative, or my community, that there is a job available. So I get that information. I come into the city. I typically bunk in with a relative or a friend. So I actually live in, where they are living right now, whether it's, slums, whether it's, other urban villages, all of these places. After that, what is my affordability at this point of time? So monthly rentals in Delhi NCR, I'm talking about areas like Ghaziabad in Delhi, say Chakkarpur in Gurgaon. My monthly rental is about 2,500 rupees. That's because what I stay in is pretty much like a shed, like a tin shed with a tarpaulin on top. That's about 2,500 rupees. If I want to get a better house, maybe with an attached toilet or, like a one room with an attached toilet, I have to pay up to say 7,000 rupees for that. So it depends on your, income range. Can I take a 2,500 and then share it with about five people, or get a 7,000 rupee flat? After which, many of them don't have documentation. So that's another problem for the migrant. He cannot apply for a lot of these subsidy programs for housing, etc., because the government takes ID, your where you're tagged. Like if my Aadhaar and all my identification is in the village, I will be given a house there, not in the city. So these kind of issues, perpetuate. Where can I get a house? You can't port your subsidies at the moment. So they actually bunk in with existing people. After which, I need no documentation. I'm not very literate. I'm not able to fill out forms, etc. So low documentation is a great entry for me into these housing spaces, informal housing spaces. Second, I mean, beyond that, sorry, that's the fourth point. My savings are more important to me than my quality of housing and living. So I'm willing to stay in sort of tarpaulin sheds, tin sheds, without water supply coming into my house, because I'd rather save and send that money back to villages or for other needs. So I'm saving on my quality of life. I don't want to spend on it. And lastly, of course, the whole workplace. Um, as soon as I get to know about a job, I can't spend on transport. I don't want to spend, on even public transport. Like the metro is unaffordable for everybody below a certain income range in Delhi. So I will stay within a 2 to 5 kilometer radius of where I, work. So we are seeing these are the factors which are bringing people into the city, where they get jobs from and where they stay. I'll stop for now, but I just thought, see the mindset also of the person coming in. What are his choices? I'm happy to elaborate on other things.
Thanks, Rejeet. So that brings up a very interesting point. Is that when we've looked at the affordable housing rental complexes policy by the government, it's a very structured way of looking at it and provisioning of housing. But then it negates the whole community network advantage. So we could almost say that such an arrangement will not be successful because it takes away the most important ingredient that supports migration from rural to urban areas. So maybe the whole process needs to be rethought around that. Now I'll just go to Dr. Athaide and say that you've worked across the country with some of the biggest names in banking, and you've entered a sector till maybe 10 15 years ago, financing self-employed was considered a complete no-no. There were very few people who were doing this. Now, what was the maybe asking you what made you look into this sector, and how do you see with your experience with your company, where is this housing coming up? Because when you're looking at self-financed and self-employed people, they are the ones who are the most vulnerable to income shocks and possibly other challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Dhaval. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah, so to take your questions in sequence, I think the first thing is uh, having worked in this sector for quite some time, especially in housing finance, mortgage, and also in microfinance pan India. What we've seen is that there's a very wide disparity of access to credit. So if you want a 20,000 rupee loan, you will surely get it at a microfinance level when if your spouse is in the village, and you generally have the women self-help groups or joint lending groups which are there. But if you want to go above that, and if you actually want to do something like 2, 3 lakhs or 5 lakhs or 10 lakh rupee of any formal type of loan, be it a housing loan to start with, very few people get them, and it actually comes back to how formal are you in the economy, because everything in the economy is about formalization of the customer. So right from your KYC to your income, to your stability, to your banking, to your employment, and whether you are having your own business or whether you're not having your business, it is a big challenge. Now, if you actually look at numbers, if we just throw some numbers to you, we have 63 million enterprises in India. Out of that, not more than 0.3% actually formal in terms of they actually have ITR, GST, banking, decent and all, and they get access to banking credit. So you have 99%, 99.7% actually not having that. The second is they also employ people where they give cash salary. So if you actually look at the larger segment, you have almost like 400 million informal workers, including businesses who are a significant part of the economy, who are actually not able to get access to formal credit. But they actually do a very important job in the economy, and especially when we've seen in the lockdown, literally factories stopped, businesses stopped, kirana shops, and every type of activity, be a plumber, electrician, carpenter, and all was all not visible at all. So we wanted to make a difference, and what we thought, and based on what we have seen, is that it's not that it's because they don't have documents that they are bad credit. Okay, we can prove that even if they don't have formal documents, they are actually good credit if you do your analysis and research in a much more structured manner. And we've been able to demonstrate that as we do our housing loans. And as of date, while been done our business, we've not had a single customer who is delinquent. But of course, it's early days. It's more than a year now. Having said that, just coming to the second question is, where is the housing coming in? Where we are and where we've seen, our focus is basically on urban concentric outliers. Like, for example, in Mumbai, we'll be at Kalyan or Virar or maybe Palghar. In Pune, we are on the outskirts at Pimpri Chinchwad or Chakan also. Similarly, if you go to Indore, you're on Dewas, Pithampur. Bangalore also, you're on Magadhi Road or Mysore Road. Or so similarly, for every place, the maximum development which is happening is in the outliers. And that's where there's the biggest challenge that we have between development authorities, town and country planning, Gram Panchayat, and Zilla Parishad. Everyone has their own space and everyone thinks they are supreme, which is fair given that they have had a lot of powers in the past. There is, from a structure point of view, I think a lot of the authorities that are there also do a lot of work in terms of giving approval, but not as part of a master plan. And that's why we have the town and country planning uh, department, which is there. But most of these developments which happen are much more unstructured. So you have small-time civil contractors, small-time developers, CAD developer builders who build very small units. I mean, you can have studio apartments going from 4-5 lakhs onwards to 2 BHKs going for 15-16 lakhs in the outliers of every city. And that is quite prevalent. But the biggest development actually happens not in actually urban construction and apartments. Most of the people who actually build houses are actually taking land and building. So they are building a house in, you have plotted layouts, you have small, they got subdivide the family property. Someone buys a plot and then they construct on that. When we actually go to finance them, they have already saved money for buying the plot, but they don't have money to construct. And actually, that is a much more lower risk because the plot itself is more than almost 40-50% of the total value of the property of their own house. But that is where the biggest developments are happening. Small time houses in large self construction properties and also in uh, the peripheries of all the industrial townships, uh, where we see the biggest impact happening because of that is while we talk about the income earner and all, we are looking at households, and the biggest impact actually happens to the woman of the house because she goes from a chawl to a proper apartment. Uh, she gets her own privacy. She doesn't have to wait for common drinking water, common sanitation, or even in joint households, she moves to her own apartment or her own house. The children go to better schools. They have their own drinking water, gas connection, and so on. They're very proud of their own home, and they have much more time to do their own business.
Dr.
So that's
Bhide,
where
if
we.
I may just interrupt and ask you an add-on, just to speed this up, is don't you think that these areas are also more exclusionary? Because then these sort of areas develop outside uh, places of opportunity. You have very limited sort of opportunities there, and they create a ghetto of some sort.
Uh, I think it is yes and no to some extent. So if you go to Indore, the maximum plotted layouts are around the industrial townships. If you have the Mao area or so, if you go to Bangalore, the maximum businesses are happening, the plotted areas or the development is happening on the area which is along the highway, national highway. If you go to even Kalyan side and so on, it's maximum development is happening because most of the industries are shifting there because nothing really can expand too much in Mumbai per se. So we are seeing them that all builders and developers and even people who are actually buying houses are buying in the areas where they are developing the areas where there is a maximum opportunity. So the first thing that anyone sells, even if it's a apartment or a house or a plot, is how far are you from the nearest railway station, the nearest industrial township, industrial area, or the nearest MIDC area, or how far are you from the nearest place where there is an opportunity to get work. The second thing which they sell is that what are the developments in that area, like how the schooling can be mixed and whether the schools are good, whether you have English medium schools. So there's a lot of migration of people. As soon as they shift their flat, their children, they immediately send their children to the English medium school from the vernacular medium. And the third thing that they also tell is that how far are you actually from having your own, being on, you're having your own transport, taking a bike and going on the road.
Thank you. So I had one question, and I think what I would like Mr. Mehta to first comment on that. That over the last few years we looked at a lot at integrated development, and we've seen this huge townships coming up with everything. And it was this whole walk to work concept with your retail and schools and all being there, and they are by definition exclusionary. Now, when we want to look at a more inclusive neighborhood, we would more likely say that it has to be catering to people with multiple incomes. Now, that is not going to happen to a large extent till the government steps in. So, in cities like Mumbai, where it is difficult to get such developments, or developments are more dense, slum rehabs and all do provide a certain level of inclusion in that sense. But do you think the government could play a role more actively uh, by having different sort of building guidelines for different segments of uh, housing? What would be your viewpoints on this?
I'm also myself looking. Let me just first put the issue in perspective, your question in perspective of the topic that we are discussing today, because I myself am looking answers for that. Let me tell you what are the parameters that we are discussing today. The topic says very clearly it's inclusive, mixed, high opportunity neighborhoods. So when we say this, let us look at the issues involved. The first issue is what is an opportunity, whether it is high or low, let's come to that later. What is an opportunity? The first thing which I look at is, when I look at myself, is my first opportunity is how close am I to my job? How close is my job from the place where I stay? That's the first thing. Then I say opportunity housing. Second, how far is my spouse going to be from her job? Most of the incomes are going to be double incomes now, and you'll have both of them working. Slowly it'll happen. Migrants, yes, today he migrates, he's alone or she's alone, then tomorrow the spouse joins in and he or she also starts working and they look for jobs. So that's the second issue. Third, how close is the school? Fourth, are health facilities available in the neighborhood or not? And when I say health facilities, I don't mean the five-star hospitals, I mean the affordable health facilities. What I can afford. I may not be able to afford a five-star hospital. So these are some 5 parameters that I am looking at. That's first when I look at opportunity. Now let me look at the opportunity is emanating from where. So if you're looking for housing coming up in a commercial area, you have the whole spectrum. You have high level executives, and you also have a person who comes and cleans your office, or somebody who provides some basic minimum service like providing cooked food to the people who come in to work there. So there's a whole spectrum of people who are looking for housing in and around commercial spaces. When you look at housing, opportunity housing in a residential area, normally it falls only into one category, which is the house help and the drivers. You don't have high level executives. Of course, he has a house on his own. What he is looking for is employing somebody who works as a house help or works as a driver or some doing some menial jobs in the house. That's the second issue that we are looking at. Now look at the solutions that are coming up. So first, being a student of mathematics, the number of variables that you're trying to solve in the equation of opportunity, high opportunity housing are plenty, are huge. Now we are trying to find a solution to this. The more the variables, the more difficult is the solution. Now let us look at what the solutions are. Number one, to my mind, rental housing is the key solution to this. Rental housing is going to be the key solution. But where are the problems in rental housing today? One, investment in rental housing is not coming in. And that's not coming in for 2, 3 reasons. One, psychologically, as Indians, we try to buy or build a house for ourselves. अरे घर होना चाहिए, अपना इतना career किया, उसके end में घर होना चाहिए. So when I make or build a house, very rarely I am doing it to invest for rental. I'm doing it for myself. So when I say कि मेरे लिए घर होना चाहिए, I look at many other issues rather than an opportunity. Now let us look at the returns in a rental housing. The return in rental housing is today just about 2 to 3%. Why should I invest? If fixed deposit is giving me 5.5 to 6%, why should I invest in a house and get 2% return for rents? I'm not. The only thing that can be is that there is a cyclical spurt that will come in property prices that will give me a windfall profit. But to my mind, that's not happening in the Indian property market anymore. We've not seen huge spurts in property prices. The property prices, no, more or less, have been stable. So why should I invest? And the third is the regulatory problems. If I give my house on rent, is it going to be vacated or is it not going to be vacated? people have been pushed into what we call the housing in the shadows of the law. So there it is neither an investment nor a rental nor anything else. It's simply protection money. And protection money is defined by the demand and the strength of the person who's protecting you. He defines the kind of money that he's going to collect from you. So we have a very complex issue at hand. And I think we need a very, very solution which goes beyond the government. It cannot just be the government that intervenes. Because today government is intervening in housing only through two instruments. One is the instrument of land. Government, fortunately, unfortunately, happens to be the largest landowner. And most of the land is encroached. So either you have slums over there or you have some other housing happening there or something or the other. So either we are in intervening through the land as this thing or through planning as a regulatory mechanism by giving more FSI, less FSI, incentivizing certain areas in building and not incentivizing certain areas in building. So my feeling is that when we talk of opportunity housing in India, we need to look at many parameters and tailor make a policy for each different parameter separately so that gets taken into account. Honestly speaking, Dhaval, I have not given any answer. I have just raised questions. And I'm very honest with myself. These are huge questions that trouble us as urban planners. When we were making the Bombay Development Plan 2034, these are huge, disturbing questions for which I really do not have a straight answer. Because there are too many parameters that we are playing with. I leave it to you and people who are working in the field of academics, people who are there on the ground, people who are in the field of finance, to see what kind of answers we have to these complex issues that we are dealing with.
No, that's a very interesting point, because lately we've been trying to look at how do you incentivize rental through a combination of government and impact capital. So just to give you an example, I was looking at some funds which generated around which had a target IRR of 4% to invest in housing microfinance. And when we did the numbers, talked to a few of the investors. So we found that there was a lot of interest in putting in impact capital with very low returns. And I was in the process of structuring a deal with one of the governments where the investors were ready to take around a 3% IRR on their capital over a 25-year-old period. But that needs a lot of intervention and effort by the government to bring it in. So that brings me to my next question, which is, as Mr. Mehta rightly said, inclusive neighborhoods. He sees them as opportunity in individual segments. So, Dr. Bhide, how would you or Rejeet look at this? And could you give us some examples on what you think are ideal neighborhoods which have maybe come up in India, which have maybe come up internationally in this space, and which could act as templates or guide to policies that we can follow?
Yeah. Thanks for this interesting question, Dhawan. Uh, and I think, firstly, I would just clarify where I'm coming from. Okay? And I think that the kind of profile of housing seekers that Malcolm talked about is quite a distinct profile from the group of migrants that we were earlier talking about. And I think that separation definitely needs to be made. Okay? People who are looking to settle in the city have a very different set of needs as opposed to perhaps people who have come fresh into the city, for whom savings from work matters as much more uh, in some ways than the housing conditions that they live in. So this is something that we have to clarify. Now, if we have to provide housing for this second group, which is the recent entrants to the city, coming at the lower end of the employment market, which is largely informal. Their employers are running informal enterprises as well. I think the interventions that we need to think about have two, three keys to it. Clearly, they cannot be as simple as just constructing our way out through it. It needs to be a multitude of solutions. And where I come from, there are two, three suggestions or two, three examples that we can think of. Uh, Not the most ideal of examples, but to look at many of the special economic zones which were initiated in China. in cities like Shenzhen, then followed by Hangzhou, and many cities on the east coast of China, where local governments also build worker estates. And not only do they build worker estates, they also manage these estates. And where industries are encouraged to invest in specific number of units. And I think this is a model which is definitely workable, especially because industries also tend to cluster, even though industries have decentralized and the size of enterprises is small to medium, that accounts for a bulk of our industry and enterprises. I think mobilizing these employers together uh, and creating and forging partnerships between the government uh, and the private sector to construct these kind of rental estates, creating and encouraging, or rather incentivizing, an entire group of perhaps what can be called as social landlords. Again, a model which has been tried in several of the UK cities for rental housing. And these social landlords can manage these estates. This is where perhaps civil societies can come in, and which is this is the second. But in order to do this very clearly, only housing cannot be the approach. Employers are not incentivized to invest in these unless you employ a characteristic approach where their liabilities uh, and their responsibilities towards larger society, uh, they need to be reminded of that. Larger corporates need to come in terms of, because many of these larger corporates are actually subcontracting many of these smaller enterprises. So some contribution from them would be expected. Of course, the government to use both labor legislation and registration, and at the same time facilitating and giving land permissions and incentives on that land. I think it's a combination of these housing and land policies, along with perhaps social protection policies, which can really crack the code in some ways. We already have some successful examples of that emerging in Tamil Nadu, where for women laborers, the Tamil Nadu state government has created a very interesting rental housing model. We already also have a similar example and schemes coming up in Kerala. And I do think these are things which are doable even in the most complex of cities like Mumbai. The Mumbai Corporation, in fact, in their development plan, already shows some pathway, some trigger to do this for women. There is a provision for multi-purpose housing for women within the development plan of Mumbai, and there are two large units which are actually being built. The corporation has not tried this or taken this initiative in the case of migrant laborers. But I think we can learn from some of these pilots and really forge together these solutions. I think what this requires, therefore, is a significant leadership which can come from the municipal corporation, because this does require the state leadership. But this is not state built housing, this is not state operated housing. This is therefore bringing in multiple actors for comprehensive solutions. And it is not just a housing solutions, it is a uh, comprehensive solution that we need to look for.
No, that's very interesting because when we've looked at housing policies that mandated a few percentage of houses need to be kept for a certain underprivileged section, we saw a lot of arbitrage. So rental definitely, according to you, seems to be the way ahead, but we need to structure it very differently. So before just as an elaboration on this question, Rejeet, as an urban planner, do you think that it is possible to create these sort of zones within larger cities that maybe are more controlled by some policies of rental? and in some ways make them exclusionary for ownership, because that is maybe the only way you will be able to create some balance.
Sure, Dhaval. In fact, it depends on whether the city is already completely built up, like Mumbai versus other cities that have more land to grow out into.
No, but if we let's say take an example of Mumbai with the eastern seaboard opening up potentially, and opening up huge amounts of land in the master plan in that way, should something like this, do you think, would be interesting to look at?
So I think first and foremost, we should just accept the reality. So we know that, a lot of housing is no longer, in Mumbai, it is far out, whether we are going past, Thane, we're going past, say, Borivali, then the housing is coming up. So in many ways, accept the reality. There will be communities that come on the peripheries in every city, whether it's Bangalore, in Delhi, in Mumbai, it's happening. The best way to deal with that is to connect them with good public transport. And this is done in many cities, again, globally. Even Singapore does this. They ensure that, you can live very far from work centers, but you'll be connected within 30 minutes thanks to a good public transport service. Of course, there it means metro. Mumbai has that advantage thanks to the railways. Commuter rail is not present in most cities in India, so that's a challenge, but an advantage for Mumbai. If you can connect people from their place of stay to their place of work under 1 hour, if you can travel within 1 hour, that becomes a great way. So you can retain those communities, make sure they're connected to opportunity in a convenient, comfortable, fast way. So that's one way. Second is, of course, the other reality is cities are going to expand. So Mumbai, you're saying, is developed, but there's a great example coming from Ahmedabad. So, for example, when they do town planning schemes, there is an amount of land, about 10 to 15%, that is reserved within the city as it grows out. Every time they do a TP scheme, there is land reserved for economically weaker section housing. Now, we've done a study of this through WRI, and what we found is these sites then remain, pockets of land with the government that they can apply for several schemes for, whether it's a Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, JNURM, etc. So across the city, so that brings well distributed housing and good numbers of housing across the city. So you're next to good opportunities as the city grows out. They have about 80,000, houses have been sanctioned like that in the past. These lands of opportunity can be used for rental as well, because the land belongs to the government. They can choose the use, whether they give it for ownership housing or rental, so you can do that as well. The third one would then be within the city. So for example, in the city of Mumbai, I actually stayed in Parel for a bit. I'm talking about 10 years ago, and I stayed in a cluster redevelopment scheme. The first cluster redevelopment was a chawl redevelopment of the Islam Mill compound. And what happens there is, there's a very clear distinction between the sale component housing, which becomes sort of the front, of the development, and the way to get into sort of the redevelopment is really, a little alley at the side, and you're going behind there. Now, what I find as an issue with this kind of housing is actually the design, and that's another sort of parameter. One is connect. I mean, like I said, connect peripheral housing back to jobs so that they can get there within time. Second, save land as you move out so that economically weaker section can happen. And then we're talking about within the city. The design is very important. So, as you would know, in terms of the finances, they tend to construct very, very high buildings. So, when you're talking about ground plus about 30 stories, and that's the kind of building I stayed at, for 10 years, the developer will maintain that building for you. But after 10 years, the people on ground have to maintain it, the actual owners. And for them, the electricity costs, high rise buildings don't work for economically weaker sections. So,
If I may just,
yeah.
just 1 second, we just got 2 minutes left. So
Sure.
if you could, Dr. Athaide and Dr. Bhide, both just give one comment, because your point of view is very strong on creating transportation networks and having the right business building typology. So if there's one takeaway you could say to create this sort of inclusive neighborhoods, with your closing remarks, just in the interest of time.
Sure.
Apologies for that.
Should I go first or?
Yeah, please, you go
All
first.
right. So, well, of course, like the connecting one, the second, why don't you service existing developments? We're speaking about high density, low infrastructure areas. Give them trunk infrastructure. This is done very well in Delhi. They have changed legislation to ensure you give provision. Don't wait for tenure. That's going to wait forever. Give them high infrastructure quality levels as well. You will see change in their quality of life and improve your building heights to be more ground plus 4 buildings. You can achieve high densities through these typologies as well. Thank you.
Prathai, I think you are looking at one of the most interesting business building typologies, because I always feel that that self-built housing, which can be incrementally increased, is the need of the hour. So maybe one point you think is extremely critical to creating inclusive stock.
Okay. Okay. So while I've dwelt on it, I think I have one viewpoint here. So there is a shortfall of around 40 million houses in the urban centers as of date, and this is a study by ICRE. It can't be done just by policy changes and all. And to my mind, the way that we have started with the work with the smart cities and has to be inclusive development. At the end, every city has to have its own social development return on investment, and it is not just a commercial return on investment. The government being the biggest landowner, even at the current stage, or even in most of the cities and places around the world, they should align the economic in its incentives with the inclusiveness incentives. And the other is that they have to create high opportunity areas. Um, Having said that, I think rental housing is one of the biggest opportunity for people to move to a place, especially migrants to move to a place which is close to their place of work. And by doing that, they also increase the opportunity for their children. And it also creates that type of mixed neighborhood, which is what the city developed. It's not just that we want high flying neighborhoods, it has to be mixed, inclusive neighborhoods. It gives us sensitivity and also a cultural uh, bring to the city. Yeah, that's my take.
So, Bhide, any one point that you would consider the most important for this?
Actually, if
Because
you don't mind, can I give two?
please.
Okay. So the first is, as I said, key if one is talking about rental, I mean, for migrant housing, where one is talking of a low employment, high opportunity, I think rental housing is the key. But this rental housing, as I suggested earlier, needs to come by a twinning or thinning of several approaches: social protection, housing, and employment going hand in hand, with a leadership being taken here by the state, but also creating partnership with multiple actors. The second is, I think I completely subscribe to the model of affordable housing which Malcolm is proposing, which is really talking to the small end of the construction, uh, rather than encouraging only high end developers. The real affordable housing today is really either by self construction or it is through small contractors. So, how do we stitch together and create a regulatory framework to facilitate that affordable housing at the peripheries? This is for a model, because this both of these interventions can take away a considerable pressure from the actual pent up housing demand and housing. Uh, that's where.
Thank you so much. I think the underlying current that we got from the conversation was that we do need to seriously promote rental. At the same time, look at better connectivity options, because that would create inclusivity at a much higher scale. And I think what Dr. Bhide said also answers Mr. Mehta's questions, that how do you address this shortfall in rental yield and returns? It could be a combination of low cost impact capital, with industry involvement. And going ahead, we could look at different typologies and different solutions instead of looking at one solution fits all to address this issue. So with that, I think we've already run a few minutes over. So I'd like to thank all of you for your time and invaluable comments. And I hope that it was as interesting for you as it was for me. Thank you.